Hey everybody, welcome to DBS Films Podcast. My name is Kellen. With me as always is my brother Brendan, and together we make movies with DBS Films. On today's podcast, we're going to do a scene-by-scene breakdown of our second found footage movie and our sixth movie in total, The Haunting of the Suicide House. In these episodes, we basically go through the entire movie, giving you a little bit of inside thoughts, what we did right, usually what we did wrong, and what we would look at doing to basically improve the overall story or the concept here. As always, we make movies for our fans with our fans, so be sure to go ahead and take a look at our Discord channel, take a look at our movies online. We have The Haunting of the Murder House. Our newest film is on Amazon. We have Into the Forest and The Girl in Cabin 13 on Tubi that you can watch for free. Be sure to check it out. Really means the world to us. So, I think the really interesting thing about this scene-by-scene breakdown is we actually have the 2.0 version of it, which is The Haunting of the Murder House. So I think now is kind of a good time before we just start explain, our theory on kind of the rough concept, what a 2.0 version means, and just why we're a huge believer in the idea that, you improve, you learn, and, by filming an entire movie, it just becomes that much easier to say, I would do this, not do this, and so on.
Yeah, I think as a beginning filmmaker, it's super crucial to do 2.0 versions because it's almost like a little bit of a cheat code. The first thing is you're going to get better at such an exponential rate when you're consistently making these movies. So we made this one probably 4 or 5 years ago, and my ability to tell a good story, my ability to work with actors, my ability to shoot a movie is just exponentially better than it was back then. And so, just being able to make a better product is a huge part of, growing as a filmmaker. And I think that a lot of filmmakers, they'll make one movie and then, it takes a couple years before they make their second movie. And, you really have to continually make these things to really grow. The growth from, that I've experienced from Gone, which is our first movie, to pretty much the shapeshifter is just, absolute exponential. And you have to see that most filmmakers only make one or two movies and they either quit or just, continue to struggle with the process. I mean, if that filmmaker made 8, 9, 10 movies, I think that you would really be able to tell the story much better. And I think having the movie uploaded, allows you to take a step back because I can no longer change the movie. So my opinion and, my ego can kind of get removed and I can sit down and really take a deep dive into the movie. What do we do well? What do we, make? What mistakes did we make? Where can we fix up this story? And I think what you're seeing with the release of the Murder House is just how much better we got because I looked at all the issues with this movie. We fixed them. We added more spice. That combined with the fact that, I'm a better filmmaker now, just gave us just a much better product. And I could have went with a different idea. We could have done something completely different. But, every time you're doing these 1.0 movies, the first time you do it, it's just there's going to be a lot of things that you just don't anticipate happening, things that beats and story structure that are just not as good as they could be. And it's just as a new filmmaker, I think the hardest thing is to take the vision that you have in your head and actually tell that story. And by uploading these things, you get that story and you can fix it. So I definitely recommend, filmmakers to make a movie and try and remake it somewhere down the line. And we're even looking at doing 3.0 and 4.0 versions of these movies because even though The Murder House has been an absolute success, the reviews have been absolutely great. It's won a whole bunch of film festival awards. It's probably two more versions off from being like a really, really tight, really solid movie. So you're probably looking about 2 years to really being able to tell the story, the core concept of this movie that I want to tell.
Yeah, I think that's really important to kind of highlight in the sense of, it's just the insane amount of improvement you get when you literally end up going from a finished product to, that idea to that finished product. It really just highlights a lot of the different things. And I mean, being able to have that resource you can draw upon is just so amazing to just really put things in perspective for you. And also, I think one thing that, some people listening to this or, not familiar with the movies might say is like, oh, well, isn't that just kind of bad that you're like ripping off the same concept or doing like the same thing there. Realistically, you could watch The Haunting of the Suicide House and you could watch The Haunting of the Murder House, and they're two completely different movies. Like, you probably wouldn't even be able to guess if they were the same film company in the sense of how it looks, how it was shot. One big thing is one's found footage, and then the first one's found footage, and then the Haunting of the Murder House is cinematic. So that kind of changes things up. But even then, I mean, the big details are kind of shifted so much in the style of it that really it's basically taking what works when it comes to overall concepts, what doesn't work, and then finding a new way to kind of heighten it up and tell it. So, in our opinion, you really can't even tell the difference. So I think any filmmaker who's hesitant about refilming an idea or being like, I'm done with this, completely, as we mentioned, we advise against that. We say whether it's the technical skills that improve or whether it's the storytelling improve, you're going to have a much better project on the second time. So, really highly recommend that, especially for newer filmmakers, because instead of trying to formulate and do a new concept or doing all of these things, I think one of the other benefits of The Haunting of the Murder House is, like, I mean, we wrote that script incredibly quickly because we knew exactly what works, exactly what doesn't work, and it just expedites the whole process. And at the end of the day, I think one of the biggest metrics for how good of a filmmaker you are is how many films you make, just because of the raw experience you get. So, with that being said, we're going to go ahead and hop into The Haunting of the Suicide House. Big disclaimer, this is my least favorite of our movies. I'm actually not the biggest fan of found footage, although I'm being slowly turned around by the Discord channel and just, other found footage fans. I will say I love found footage fans, and that's why we're basically going back to it. But in the sense that I don't like, kind of how it turned out, a few things like, well, I'll hop into details as we go on the scenes. Again, as always, very proud of this movie. Absolutely amazing job. And on the whole scale, when you take this movie from what the final project actually is to what the production was on the back end, this movie was the easiest movie to make. I mean, I think we were in and out in like 3 months, essentially. This was the milestone in DBS where we're like, we want to continue to make these movies. So right off the heels of Into the Forest, we hopped right into The Haunting of the Suicide House. And we literally had this movie done, ready to go, basically at the same time as Into the Forest. So, before we do hop in there, do you want to kind of talk about overall your thoughts on The Haunting of the Suicide House, and also the production? Because to me, I think the biggest highlight of the Suicide House is this was a breeze of a production.
Yeah, and it's one of the reasons that I think as an indie filmmaker, you should take a look at doing found footage just because of the ease of the production and the ease of post-production. I think post-production is probably, we always say it's where movies go to die. And one of that reasons is that it's just very, very time consuming to edit a cinematic movie. You have so much coverage and you have to do the color on that coverage. You have to do the sound, the audio, all that stuff is very, very time consuming, as opposed to found footage where you really just try and take the best takes and then really just try and look at the movie and pace it properly. So it's just much easier on the post production, and even on production, yes, you need to get the actors to, all say their lines correctly, and you have to have the blocking down because you're gonna have these longer extended scenes, but that allows you to take more takes because you don't need to do proper coverage. And when I say proper coverage, that's wides, close-ups, and then tights. You don't really need to do that. You can spend that time getting additional takes on your oneers, essentially. So it allows for a smoother production. You can move a little bit faster. And, once again, people who like found footage will forgive a lot of issues. If there's audio issues and, to a degree, some camera footage issues, it's supposed to be gritty. It's supposed to be kind of rough, and they'll forgive some of that stuff, as opposed to, in cinematic, they're looking at, comparing your movie to the next $5 or $10 million movie that they saw, or even to like the Marvel movies. And to get that level of detail, to have that level of production value for anything under $1 million is just very difficult to replicate. But I think The Unseen, it was a milestone in DBS history because we did finish Into the Forest, and it didn't do very well as far as like people watching it all the way through. It had a lot of story issues. This one did very well. It was our top performing movie out of the Hateful Eight. People watched it from start to finish, and it didn't get well reviewed because there's a lot of issues with the movie, but it showed me the potential of making a movie that is just well paced and It's not a good movie. It's, I guess you would call it like a bad movie, but it's not a boring movie. So it keeps everyone's kind of attention in there. And that's really all you need as an indie film studio to be successful, is to have a movie that people will watch all the way through. So I think, the confidence this one gave us on from getting our money back perspective, and the fact that we did shoot Into the Forest the month before, we shot this one a month later, we shot The Morgan Estate 2 months later, and then I think the next month we shot Devil in the Room. So we shot 4 movies in essentially 6 months. To have that level of production just made us made us such better filmmakers, because I mean, that is almost a lifetime of experience that a lot of people get. Some people don't make 6 movies in their entire life. So to be able to do all that stuff really accelerated our curve to the point where we had to really take some time to step back and really make sure that the stuff that we learned got implemented properly. And that's where essentially The Girl in Cabin 13 came out, from all this work that we put in this year.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to summarize it. I completely agree. So, without further ado, let's hop into The Haunting of the Suicide House. So, this is a concept I absolutely love. I think it still has a lot of miles in the sense that we could do a 3.0 version. But basically, the core overall concept is you have a group of YouTubers, live streamers, whatever the median is. They're essentially out there hunting for a night at a haunted location and things go bad. Pretty straightforward. I'm sure, it's been done tons of times to different degrees, but there's just a lot there. It really does solve one of the biggest issues when it comes to, get in, get out, in the sense of like if they're actively looking for the paranormal, they might be less inclined to leave. So it really kind of sets it up there. I love the YouTube angle and element of it is kind of my thing, just because, nowadays everyone wants to be a content creator. So I think you can really pull from it. I mean, right now, the Shutter film that's coming out, it's all about being basically like I think they fully embrace the YouTube element of it. So I think it's something where, I love this core concept. I think there's a lot to run with it. And then again, for found footage, I think at the time I was still kind of open to it. I think after like going through it and seeing it and then watching other indie films, I was kind of suspicious on it. But I will say the intro part, I think the intro is really good at kind of explaining it with like a show don't tell. But one thing that we are seeing from the found footage community, and I think this is something to just kind of mention to people who are out there doing found footage, and I'm not quite sure. I'm curious if you're thinking about it because I actually haven't talked to you about this. Are you planning on doing things like having a score in the background or this hybrid found footage? Because basically the intro scene's cinematic here, and then we put scores there. And I will say, just getting like the found footage feedback, people are like, it sounds like they want you to embrace full on found footage, no audio tracks, no things there. So one, I'm curious what you think about how we did a hybrid. And then two, what your thoughts are moving into the Forest 2.0.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of the hybrid stuff. Like how we did this. I think I agree with the found footage people on the sense that you want to kind of choose one or the other. And I think I can do a cinematic movie where you use elements of found footage like we did in the Whitlow house with the cop cam, and there's ways to incorporate it because the first person stuff is spookier, it's easier to get jump scares, it puts you in the moment. Um, but I think the people who are looking for found footage, want to see a found footage movie. I think that this we should have just picked up with them running through the hotel. I think something, punchier should have happened to them at the end. And then they could just cut back to them, watching it on an editing software or actually watching it on their computer to get that found footage element. As far as the music goes, oh, we're gonna put music in this.
All right,
After
I got one
seeing
stars for you coming from the found footage
Yeah,
community.
I'm gonna have to eat those, and I think the difference is after seeing how much music affects the movie and the tone and the pace, it's just something I don't think, we can go without. I think the issue that might have been with the music in these found footage movies, um, is the fact that, we probably didn't mix the audio properly, so the music was probably louder to hide a lot of issues than it really needed to be, and it's not gonna be like the Morgan Estate where the score kinda takes a front row seat to a lot of the stuff, but I do wanna have, the tension, the apprehension machine in the background, just to give it the push it needs to build the suspense. It's very subliminal. So I mean, we'll try it out. We can give the Discord community a cut without a score, and I can give you a cut with a score. I mean, we're gonna limit the score. It'll be almost like background noise, but I have a good sneaking suspicion that the one with music is gonna just perform much better. But it's something we could test out. But even now, when I'm watching found footage movies, a lot of them have a score in there. And it's kind of surprising. A lot of the paranormal activity movies have scores in them. And it's just, I think it's like a subliminal response. The feedback we get from a lot of our movies that don't have the score in there, people are just like, this is boring, the pacing's off. And then we just put some music on there, and all of a sudden it just completely changes. So it's something we could play with, but off of as of right now, I'm planning to add a score and sound effects to obviously these movies.
Yeah, I mean, I would honestly say I'm still kind of on that fence because it was the biggest comment that came up when we were kind of on the found footage Facebook pages, and shout out to that community, man. Really cool people out there. But I do agree. I mean, like music plays such an important role, and I think what you were mentioning is most likely kind of the major issue in the sense that we just probably did it improperly. We probably it was too obvious, either hiding issues or things like that. We were still using the beautiful boom mic, which means just terrible audio quality. And I think that's kind of really when it comes down to it, what we were using a crutch for. I mean, I would keep the same exact intro, just put the camera in the corner. You know what I mean? Like there's your security cam, and then have the police turn on the camera. But I think, yeah, we kind of missed the boat here because imagine you're watching found footage. You're like, oh, I want to watch a found footage movie, and then you watch a cinematic intro, and then you turn it off because you don't think it's found footage. Because basically, we take about 2 minutes or so for them to pop in the tape, which in our opinion, that's so cool. You pop in the tape, and then from there you go from found footage or whatever. And I think that might just be a little bit confusing to people who want to watch found footage and then think they're watching cinematic, so they turn it off. People who want to watch a cinematic movie and then suddenly it becomes found footage. That being said, it still was one of our best performing ones. So really kind of interesting in how that plays out. I would say though, I mean, I love the style of intro. I think it's very straightforward. It's really smart. I mean, I think we did a better one with the murder house in the sense of or not this intro, but character introduction. I mean, it's basically the same thing, really. So I would say the first, them running out of it, the scare of it, I think it was cheap and quick and easy. And as an indie filmmaker, you need to do it. I think, we could have probably spiced it up, maybe making it look spookier. It's not, I think that's kind of the bane of this entire movie is it just needs to look scarier. But I think them running out of the warehouse, kind of like a fake thing, you think this might be what happened. And it just kind of reveals that, they're YouTubers and gives you just a little bit of, hey, here's what's going to go on. So how do you feel about that little intro? Essentially the second intro, because it's the found footage intro.
Yeah, I mean, it's not good and it's not bad. I think it needs to be punchier. I would have had them in like a dark haunted house and something, because we do allude that they fake it later on. I think we should have just faked it again, or just had something happen, something fall over, something scary, light falling on the ground, just to scare them, and then just have them run out of there, and then they could kind of put on their little spiel. But I mean, I would have done that, or put them in a situation where like they're really, you really think something bad has happened to it. Maybe the camera like falls and flickers and turns off, and we hold for a couple seconds, and then it pulls back to them editing the footage or uploading the footage to like their YouTube channel. I think would have been punchier, because once again, for the intro, you really want to make sure the stakes are there, that the stakes of your life are explained to the audience. And for the intros, you really got to make them punchy. Like they just got to be very punchy. This is the first time these people are watching your movie, especially for platforms like Tubi and AVOD. You got to get these people hooked, and the best way to get people hooked is having a really good intro. I have all the data in the world to show that if you have a weak intro, you're going to have a lot of problems. And honestly, I think that to look at the Into the Forest versus this intro, the reason this movie did much better was because this intro is much better than the Into the Forest.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that in the sense of, you're kind of right there thrown into it. of just, with the police scene, what's happening. You get the little bit of the introduction. I love the title sequence. Honestly, came out really good. That's probably the spookiest thing about this movie. And then we have our standard, and I'm a fan of this type of character dump. And I think the one benefit of a found footage movie is you have an audience, and typically you talk directly to the audience. So, the fact that you have a camera, there's usually some character at some point in time that's just like, here's exactly what's going on. As an indie filmmaker, as any filmmaker, as any storytelling, I think you have to get used to the idea that you have to over force that story into your audience because one, they are not actively paying attention typically. They're on their phones, they're doing something else. And I think found footage has a crutch in the sense of, you know, sure, they're sitting there. We have the photos and pictures and things kind of jazz it up, which helps out tremendously. Like you need that. But for the most part, I mean, we're looking at basically 3 minutes of them talking. But I would say it's not bad. I mean, I'm sure it could be better. A lot of things could. But to me, this is a beat that I think a lot of indie filmmakers miss. A lot of times in cinematic, because you don't have this, but even in found footage. But basically, they sit down, they say, here's where we're going, here's what happened. Now, again, textbook issue that we're going to talk about. We do the same thing with Into the Forest. We have a plot, it just has so many details, and we never talk about those details more than once. So all of these things are bombarded at you, and you barely get to pick one to latch onto. Rosemary Adams, her baby, the Stone, whatever her first name was, like all of those different things end up happening where you basically explain 4 crimes, when now we would basically look at, with the murder house, we looked at one very specific crime with Lester. So what's your overall thoughts on kind of explaining that first lore dump? I think, as we mentioned before, it suffers from the very wide, not very deep mentality, shallow in the sense of substance. But what do you think of that overall?
Yeah, I think one reason that found footage also works on the indie scale is because it forces you to, like Kel said, narrate to the audience. And when you're breaking the fourth wall, you're narrating to the actual camera, it is engaging. I think it's more engaging than, the pizza and beer scene in Whitlow, for example. There's just a lot of stuff that you could just kind of dump. You could use pictures. We use graphics in this one. I thought one of the better scenes was also in Into the Forest where we used all the pictures. So I think it's engaging. It's an easy way to dump lore, explain what's going on in an engaging way so that, your audience doesn't get bored. I think as a beginning filmmaker, the hardest thing is to keep the audience engaged in your downbeats because you need to explain this stuff or people are going to get confused. But you have to really find a way to do it in an engaging way so that people aren't turning this off because they're being bored. And I thought we did a good job in this movie. But yeah, once again, like you have to pick one thing as far as the story, the overall plot, and just run with it. Same exact issue we had in Into the Forest, this is just another example of why you really want to have these movies uploaded before you work on the next one, or at least you get them to the point where you can get the feedback from an audience. Because the first thing we would have got if we would have had Into the Forest uploaded was, hey, I don't understand what's going on. And we could have fixed that in this movie. Instead, we do the same mistake twice. And, it's just we needed to pick one of these things. There's 6 or 7 different things, like, as far as what was going on in the house, and I think we just needed to pick one and just roll with it, and I think it would have made a cleaner movie, and it would have just been better. The interesting difference is that more people were confused with Into the Forest because of the shapeshifter ending, where this one, people weren't that much confused, but they just never really understood like what was going on. But because there was enough beats in there and it kind of became, like a shittier version of The Shining, people understood like, all right, like he got possessed at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that really helps highlight it. I think kind of having the Rebecca Stone character where she, essentially was like, I can hear voices and whatnot, helps clarify it. So in that sense, like I would delete Rosemary Adams. You know what I mean? Just delete that, be like, something happened and you get possessed, and it's just about the one possession with the girl. Again, you got to pick one thing and run with it. Yeah, I agree. As you were mentioning, you talk directly to the camera. So we have a really good idea. And then it cuts to, so this is something you always got to kind of think of. And in my opinion, I think in hindsight, I would say we almost overthunk it to some degree. Like, I don't think people would really kind of care as much, but setting up a reason to have two cut points. So, we basically have the video, and then it cuts back to the main part, character Summer, where she's basically like, hey guys, this is my side channel that we're doing here. And like, you have points. And I think it's a strategic thing there, but I really do feel like almost kind of we specifically were focusing coming from a cinematic, like, when does it make sense to have the cameras and whatnot, where I almost feel like you can just kind of cut like where you want, as long as you kind of have an open idea of like, yeah, they're YouTubers or something like that. So we cut to the side one. I think it is a good way to have that pace, because again, you have to find a way to break it up. But I also, just as kind of like a little thing for found footage, I don't think people are really as focused on that as much as, at least I feel like we were thinking about it, or at least for the first two.
Yeah, I mean, you always wanna try and just make sure that the stuff that you're shooting makes sense, but we've done 2 found footage movies now, and there's if you look closely and you pay attention to the movies, there's a lot of stuff that just doesn't make any sense as far as, like, why someone's using the camera or where this angle's even coming from, and nobody really brought that stuff up. So, I mean, obviously, try and make sure the details work. You do kinda wanna have 2 cut points, but I mean, like, we'll get into it when you go to the girl that they interviewed. There's 3 cut points in that interview, but they only have 2 cameras, I believe. So, where's that 3rd one coming from? And nobody brought that up. And I think that as long as you're not doing something absolutely crazy where it pulls out of the story, like even in Into the Forest, we talked about it before, the guy that gets dragged never really had a camera, and nobody said anything about that. So, worst case scenario, people aren't going to really complain about it. Like I said, the found footage community is a lot more forgiving, and they're just really trying to, tell the story and stay in the story, as opposed to, just making sure every single detail's there. But I mean, like, I'm doing the Into the Forest 2.0 script right now. I'm starting to, create the not the shot, well, like sort of like the shot list, because I am the DP. I understand what I'm going to do, but I'm trying to figure out, like, all right, where am I going to put the camera in this scene? We have a lot of interview scenes, and I think for the interview scenes you really do need 2 cut points. So it's just trying to figure out the smaller details like that. But once again, one of the benefits of doing these movies is the audience is very forgiving.
Yeah, and I think also, if you come from, like, with us, when we went from cinematic to found footage, you're almost kind of like, what is the cut point? How does it make sense? So I think that is a good point just to kind of bring up. So now we get our amazing duo in front of the house in broad daylight, which again, I think one of the bigger issues to me is just lighting and mood, in the sense that it really can kind of affect different things. So they're there in the front yard, hey, look at us. We have our keys and whatnot. I think they did great here. And then I think this, to me, is really where like I start suffering when I watch this movie again. The house tour. I think the house tour, the way it was kind of done, it's a long scene, not many cut points for it. And I want to talk about the dual edge of found footage. Production and post-production can be, they have their, production has its strengths and weaknesses. Post-production super easy. But I think in return for not having to worry about, as much angles and footage and coverage, the big risk you have is it is incredibly tough for these actors. And now the actors that we had did an absolutely fantastic job. But when you look at the scene, like the walkthrough scene, I mean, let's see, it starts at 9 minutes and our cut point is 13 minutes. It is a 3-minute scene that we have them basically walk around and do. And now here's the thing. Typically when we do scenes, maybe a minute, minute and a half, maybe a 2-minute scene there. Well, we have different cut points. So we can literally utilize every single take to some degree. Every single take there. When you're doing a found footage and one of the actors screws up the lines, which is natural, that is what happens there, you stop and you go back from the beginning. And in editing this, the biggest issue you can have is that you just don't have a take that's essentially perfect. And it was wasn't bad at all, but there's definitely some lines that come up where someone might have forgot something, someone improv something, which then the other actor was looking for another line. And I think it just kills these downbeats. Because one, they're walking in a house in broad daylight, so it's really not that spooky. It does look like an Airbnb. We even made like kind of like a comment, like, oh, it looks like nice or something like that. All of these different things kind of play up. And on top of that, you just have lines that are getting, you basically leave the actors on the island, as I like to kind of refer to it, because whatever happened, well, that's the only take we can use because in the other takes we literally stopped. So you want to talk about the intro to the house and then also, the pros and cons of having those found footage scenes like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's engaging because you're touring something. We did this in the murder house, and being able to walk and talk and show the viewer the house, it almost allows you to not have to really use wide shots. So the viewer, if you're doing the tour of the house and this house is very small, the viewer understood exactly where everything is. And you're narrating over that. So it's kind of like a montage. And you build lore. The problem with this one, once again, is it's light out. There's nothing spooky about this house. It was a renovated location, so it looks brand new. And we just kind of threw sheets on everything. So there's really no tension or scariness in this, and I think that that's what this scene needed. It just needed no lights on. It needed flashlights, and I think just having them break into the house as opposed to actually like walking into the house is there's just more stakes, there's more tension. The cops could be coming in there. The fact that, you're in some place there where you're not supposed to be is just more engaging. It raises the stakes. Where this one, I don't think it was even explained how they even got access to this place. They just kind of walked in the front door. So I think that that is, a mistake that we fixed. We fixed it in the murder house. As far as the double-edged sword goes with the found footage, I mean, you really have to make sure that all these actors understand what they're doing. Your blocking is, on point because they have to move in a certain rhythm. Especially you have to work with the DP, it becomes like a theater performance. And you have to make sure these things are paced properly because you can't really cut this in the middle if it's like, oh, wow, this is way too long. I'm going to cut it here. You just don't have that luxury. So with found footage, yes, you don't need to do the wides and the close-ups and have all the natural coverage, but your options in post are very, very limited because you only have these long takes. So you have to really work with your DP. You have to really work with your actors, and you have to have actors that have the ability to, number one, remember their lines, and number two, have the ability to improv should they, mess up one line or something doesn't hit, some dialogue beat doesn't get hit, that they can stay in the moment and work with the other actors to get a usable take. Because I remember for this scene and the scene with the bathtub, we were probably on 15 to 20 takes of these. Like, they took a long time to do it. Um, it's just something you need to be aware of. I would, if you're doing a found footage movie, I'd really look for theater actors who can understand that, they have to stay in the performance and they have to go from start to finish. There is no stopping. There is no being like, all right, well, I could use this piece here or this piece here, because that's in a cinematic movie. That's what I'm like looking for. Cause I'm going to edit this movie. I'm like, all right, this person just needs to say these 2 or 3 words and I could cut back for a reaction shot of the other character. And this is how I'm going to edit together. You just don't have that with found footage.
Yeah, it is the case where, that's the major trade-off there, and that's why I think a lot of the downbeats, specifically in this movie, suffer. And, like, getting through this scene's honestly really tough for me. And then, I think we go to just a really, really weak pop scare in the sense of, they're like, "Where's Kai at?" And they look around and they find him, or they look around and then they see someone move through a door hole. And I think I'm really trying to remember how we had it in the script. I think that it was like this Kai pop scare, but like I think the biggest issue with this one is, to me, it's kind of a textbook. Like, we show up and we're like, all right, what are we gonna do? And it's like, okay, there's like a door hole there. It's still kind of bright out. Like, it just was a very weak scare. That being said, it's still a scare. So I think like you're starting to see again, we understand that like even if you completely miss it like a beat, you're still at least attempting to do something. So like the structure is kind of there, but what are your thoughts on the him feeling bad vibes and juju? Because like it also kind of, he was supposed to be the more psychic one, which is why he gets possessed. And I feel like it was just, poorly executed on and kind of just not the most solid idea and then poorly executed on.
Yeah, no, the scare works. I've seen it done in a lot of other movies. You'll see it where they kind of zoom in on a peephole and then something, comes across the screen. And the issue with this one is something you touched on, which was it's during the middle of the day, so nothing is spooky about this. And the second issue is that there's like a little hallway in the room. The room doesn't allow you to walk across the door frame to get that, shadowy figure running across the door. So it just looks off and we end the beat very weird with just like the slow zoom in on Kai, and it's just like I don't really remember what we were trying to get with that. Um and I remember, like, the writer was pushing for it, I believe, and I was like, "Well, you know what? I'll just cut it," and the movie just ended up being so short that we just kept it in there, but it was like, his backstory on being psychic doesn't really make any sense, or maybe had more of a connection than the others with the house, but then he's the one, like, actively trying to fake things, and he has, like, these generic crystals on his neck, I believe is, like, what it was. So it never really gets explained, it never gets really brought up, but, I mean, there's something here. Is it executed on well? No. But, at least it's something. At least it has some attempt to keep this movie and the momentum going forward.
Yeah, and I think that's really kind of, the key with it. So we go into just again another textbook, like these downbeat scenes are brutal for me. They're sitting down by the computer, and we have just another of the character development stuff where, you know, they're talking about their careers and like my mom should be proud of me, like you're gonna be big time for and like again, this is a long scene. Like this is literally 13 minutes to 15 minutes. We have them talking, and it doesn't progress them as a character, in my opinion, at all. It's tough because there's a lot of dialogue, so, things came up and changes, so, like, you can see that a few times they're kinda just hanging out there trying to get through the scene, and I'm sure we took, 5 or 6 takes of this, and this was the best of the 6 takes that each one took, 10, 15 minutes essentially of that, um but I think to me, we see this I would say this is almost like the porch scene as well too. Really focus in on kind of what your plot is, and, like, if you look at, like, the murder house, anytime they are having dialogue with one another, it's really pushing the purpose forward. It's very focused on the action, where this is just, I mean, I would say the point of this scene is for them, again, to set up the cameras and have Steven walk past and the door shuts, like, that's the entire point of this 3-minute scene to set this up, and yet we just have this useless dialogue. So, what are kinda your thoughts on this one?
I think it's just a beginner screenplay mistake. We have an hour and 20 minutes to tell these movies, and these are not character driven movies. The characters are not um driving these movies forward. The plot and the scares and the beats are driving these stories forward. So to sit down and do these like, well, what's her motivation? What are all these characters' motivations and explain it? And we did this in Whitlow House. We do it in a lot of these movies up until really Girl in Cabin 13. We just kind of removed all this stuff. And two things happened. Number one, people didn't really notice it. And number two, they started to just pick up the characters' motivations through certain scenes, like the smaller little scenes. Like when we, for example, in the murder house, people kind of understood Harper's background that she, was very driven about this. She wanted to get this thing done. She's very professional. And we could have sat down and had her have a whole narration to the camera explaining like why she is so driven and wants to get this done so much, or we could just show it to the audience and let the audience sort of fill in the blanks themselves. I think it's a more engaging experience, and it allows you to focus on moving the movie forward with scares and beats, as opposed to having these long blocky sequences where it's like, all right, these are our goals, this is why we're doing this kind of stuff. And you're kind of filling in the motivations by essentially telling them straight to the audience. So I think that, we're trying to just show that there's spooky things going on in this house. That is the goal of this scene. And you could remove this scene and the movie would have been completely fine. But the fact that, we didn't, it slows down the movie dramatically. When you only have an hour and 20 minutes to tell these stories, you really got to use that time. Every single dialogue beat has to drive the movie forward. Every single scene, as far as like how you're shooting things, every sequence has to be driving the movie forward. You just don't have the luxury to sit down for 3 minutes and be like, all right, this is my character's backstory. If we get to the point where we're making 2-hour movies, then yes, I think like you have to do that kind of stuff. But at that point, the movies have to be a little bit more character driven. And I think for what we're trying to do now in getting the fundamentals of pacing a movie properly, I think that's just a more advanced technique than we have the ability to pull off right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've always said, the downbeats are really actually the hardest parts. And I think it's a mix of, one, not understanding the storytelling, two, not having that. But man, that is it's so painful for me. And then we go from there to basically now we do the tour. And this is where it is kind of cool. Like you can see the tour from the Haunting of the Suicide House and the tour from the Haunting of the Murder House. And just how much better we got. I mean, just again, it's essentially the same exact scene. Biggest issue here is it is exactly what we're talking about. They talk about Rosemary's Baby, they talk about the husband, they talk about him coming back from Vietnam, they talk about the baby that needs to come back. They talk about, Rebecca Stone, who then hears everything and murders her family. Like there's so much stuff and they don't repeat one core concept at the same time. And I think that just kind of like, escalates it in the sense of it's the big issue where if you look at the murder house, it's Lester. They said he got possessed. Lester got possessed. He got possessed here. By the way, that interesting where Lester got possessed, that happened here. So, do you quickly want to just talk about how that's what you should focus on when you do have those attentions? Because again, same type of scene, executed completely differently and so much more effective now.
Yeah, and I think, just watch how people watch movies these days. Even if it's a very engaging movie, if you're watching it at home, your friends and family members are gonna be on their phone at some point during the movie. We're just addicted to checking our messages, checking our emails, checking social media, and any kind of downbeat in the movie, the phone comes out. And I think the difference is, especially with indie stuff, is yes, they're on their phone, but they're still listening. They may not actively be watching the movie, but they're still listening to the movie. So your dialogue is still very important. You still have to be driving this plot home in not just a visual medium, but also through the dialogue of your movie. You have to be explaining and telling the viewer, what is going on. And I watch a ton of movies while I'm working during the day, and the ones that I think are better than the others, the ones that resonate with me, are the ones that are explaining. I know exactly what's going on without having to watch the movie. And I'll always turn up and look when something, an action scene's happening or something is catching my attention. But there are some movies where I will watch it and have no idea what's going on because I can't physically watch it. I'm listening to it. And the screenplay and the characters and the way it's shot just does not lend itself to explain what's going on. And it's difficult for me to follow. Because really what you're doing with your lore and your story is just building up to the climax. You really want that last 10 or 15 minutes of your movie, in order for it to hit, in order to be punchy, in order for, to leave your viewers feeling satisfied, you have to build that lore up so they know exactly what's going on in the final 15 minutes. And we kind of touch on it here. We go back and forth, but it is a possession movie because the main character or one of the characters is going to get possessed. So when they see Kai and he's acting all kind of funky, you want the audience to be like, "Oh, yo, he's possessed. That guy's possessed." They explained this earlier, and we never really do that. So the climax of this movie is less punchy than, say, what we did in the Murder House, where we multiple times said it's a possession movie. So when you see Kai looking in the mirror all kind of funky, you're like, "Oh my God, I think he's possessed." And that was the exact reaction that we got, that I watched other people as they were watching the movie. That was their reaction. That was the reaction that we wanted to get. But it is the thing that, as an indie filmmaker, and a lot of indie films just overlook this aspect of, picking one plot, trying to keep it as minimalistic as possible, and making sure people understand what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's something really, really big to highlight because again, I think what ends up happening is if in your head, you think it's super clear because you're the one writing it. And the only reason it's clear is because you're writing it. The way people interpret movies, the way people watch movies, you really need to pick one thing and run with it. And I think that is something huge that you see in a big difference is kind of explaining it. And actually, another big difference that we see is, the first real kind of pop scare, in my opinion, or one that like hits is we have Summer. She wakes up at night. They say they heard something. They go walk around, and then pots and pans fall off. They make a scary noise, and we find out that you sort of find out again. This isn't even that clear, so it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before. You sort of find out that okay, so Kai was pulling this, and he kind of caused a fake scare, and like nothing's really mentioned too much about it specifically in the sense of like, oh, this is what's happening or so on or so forth of like them faking it. And I think that's the big difference. It was we literally have a downbeat that addresses it. We have me that addresses it, but you basically get the first hint of, oh, okay, they're faking things. And I'm curious. I think again, we probably could have done it a little bit better with the angles and how it was executed. I think one big thing is like this is why the light should be off. It's at night. It looks so much better and scarier with that. But I just kind of, what are your thoughts on how the scare was executed? And then more importantly, the difference in how we really drove home the faking it element with the murder house.
Yeah, I think it wasn't executed as well as it could have been. Just because we didn't really know what we were doing. Working with the DP, we knew what we wanted as far as the scare. We didn't really know how we wanted to do it. And this is something where it's going to be a long sequence and you have to get that pop at the end. And once again, it's not good, it's not bad, it's something, but it's not executed as proper as it needs to be. If you look at the 2.0 version of the Murder House, we had learned at this time that things falling into frame or out of frame from, places in the frame that people don't necessarily expect things to come from. So this is the top of the screen, this is the bottom of the screen, are usually ways if you can have something fall or shoot pop up, people aren't expecting it. So you get like a little bit more of a pop. It's more impactful. So I can't remember really what happened in the Suicide House. I think something fell, but it just wasn't as good as we did in the Murder House, where you can't really see anything. It just kind of falls through there. You're not expecting it at all. And just doing the dialogue so that you have an intense scene, it kind of settles with the dialogue, and you're like, all right, well, nothing's happening here, and then you hit them, is just a nice way to structure a scene properly. As far as the faking thing, yeah, it just, you do this kind of crazy thing where they're faking things, and now all of a sudden that's a big plot point. It's like, are these guys legit or not? You can't just cut to the next scene, which is like kind of what I think we did in the Suicide House. You have to linger on it a little bit. And we had in the Murder House, we had a huge dialogue scene where Harper, the lead character, is, more invested in the paranormal, and she feels like the house offers enough paranormal stuff to keep the viewers around. And you had Kai, who had the opposite logic, where he's like, hey, we got all these viewers, we have to keep them entertained. It's a really cool dynamic. It furthers the plot through engaging dialogue, and they're not yelling at each other. So you don't hate them, but they're making solid points about, both or their philosophies on how to continue moving forward with the movie or their production, essentially. So, I mean, this is just a great scene to look at why you should do a 2.0 version. We redid it in the murder house. This one, was lacking punch, it was lacking clarity, it was lacking good dialogue, and in the murder house, it's a punchier pop scare, the dialogue is punchier, and it's just an overall better scene. So we took a scene that was just alright to maybe wasn't the strongest to really making, um, a really solid scene in the murder house, so, like, you can just see the growth that we had between these movies.
Yeah, I think it really is something where the biggest differences I kind of highlight are those because it's really the same type of structure. We just figured out how to tell it much better. And then what we're going to hop into is the staple of found footage. And it's something that we're doing big. And we got a lot of DBS super fans in on it, which is always great to see. Is the interview section. So basically, they pick up the next day and you get the lore dump between these interviews. I think anyone in found footage expect that you're going to have interview scenes. And if you're not going to have interview scenes, I think you're wasting it. They add a little bit more detail, you get more characters on there. And it really kind of, spices it up. And if you think about hard cuts that you have, interviews make a very, very, it's almost basically like a downbeat montage. So you want to talk about the interview scenes and just kind of why you almost always see them in found footage, or at least I find you see them in the better ones.
Yeah, the, interviews are kind of a cheat code because it gives you the opportunity to cheat production by having multiple actors, and the fact that, you're not having these long oneers where you're kinda going through the house, you can cut these interviews up and be absolutely fine. For the Into the Forest 2.0, I plan on, having as many interviewers as we possibly can that, I feel like we can get a good performance from them, and then they just have to say a couple sentences to build the lore, and I'm just gonna chop it up and make it sort of a montage. It allows me to really use my editing skills to tell exactly what's going on in the movie. And the best interview stuff is to just make sure you have some people explaining the lore. Then you have people who believe in the lore, and then you have people who are like, nah, that's crazy. Like, there isn't any, this house isn't haunted. There's no witch in these woods. So you just kind of get different people's perspectives, and you can add some fun stuff in there as well. And it's a great way to just build the lore and, keep the production value of your movie up. Having actors adds production value, having more characters adds production value. Editing the interview montage like a cinematic movie, even though it's found footage, adds production value. So it's just a really easy way to dump all this lore. This should have honestly been way earlier in this movie, and I think it's just the fact that we stuck them here, just kind of an odd choice as far as like screenplay wise.
I was kind of noticing that our tempo is a little off here. Like it's weird ups and downs of how you would structure it. So, and again, I think, if you look at our experience now and you look at Into the Forest 3.0, the reason it's much better in the sense of where we're stacking these is we have the experience with it. So that's going to go ahead and wrap up this episode. Really before we do go into it, I just, now that we're, hopping into watching it again. I know it's been a while since you've seen it, but we watch them a little bit frequently on the movie Mondays. I think as we kind of mentioned those past two scenes, the biggest thing that stuck out to me is our story is so much clearer in the momentum so much faster. And that is just two overall improvements. Like I'm again, we honed in on the idea that they're YouTubers, so we cut out the entire thing of them having to explain it and we explain it through action of the montage and them starting the stream. It basically we eliminate, 5 minutes of downbeat in this movie by just having it shown with the action there. We also have a more intense, intro, in my opinion, just because of how we done it. Again, cinematic is a little bit different, but what are kind of your takeaways where, if you had to see what's kind of the major areas of improvement?
Yeah, I mean, this movie, the structure is a little bit all over the place. The scares are there, which is good. You're definitely seeing us progress to actually having scares that are in movies so that yes, they're not done very well, but they're at least we're putting them in the right places, and it's kind of keeping the viewer engaged just enough to kind of finish these movies. So you're kind of seeing the beat structure, us improve in the beat structure, us improve in the screenwriting process. Like I said, the interviews were kind of all over the place. The downbeats are kind of out of or kind of slow the movie down a lot. And I think now we just, as far as like what we did in the murder house, is we just, the pacing is just so much better. I mean, we really cut a lot of these downbeats out. We cut a lot of fluff out, and we just really focused on driving the plot as quickly as possible to get you to that climax. And the watch rate on the murder house is, phenomenal, because it is, you strap in and you go. That's what people are really looking for in a lot of these movies. They want to be scared, they want to be entertained, and they want to do it for 80 minutes solid. So I think that's like the biggest improvement. But I mean, just seeing the growth, like thinking about it now, just the growth from Gone to this movie was exponential. And then from this movie to The Murder House, it just comes back to what I said in the beginning of the episode. It's like, if you're only doing 2 to 3 movies, you're just doing yourself a disservice. You're underestimating, vastly underestimating how much better you're gonna get with each movie. And, the fact that we're about to do our 12th movie, and I don't feel like I haven't seen the growth slow down at all. And I think we're gonna take a big step up from the Shapeshifter to Into the Forest 2.0. I'm really excited to shoot this one. So if I'm sitting here telling you it's taking me 12 movies and I'm still seeing exponential growth every time I make a new movie, I mean, where are we going to look at, how good are we going to get when we hit movie 20? How good are we going to be when we hit movie 30? And that's kind of the exciting thing about doing this whole process, just seeing how much better you get.
Completely agree. And I know, looking forward to making many, many more movies for our fans, with our fans as always. So if you want to be part of this amazing journey, please do go ahead, take a look at our Discord channel online. You go ahead, take a look at The Haunting of the Murder House and The Haunting of the Suicide House, kind of compare them both on Amazon, see what we're talking about here. We're going to go ahead and hop into the rest of the movie in part 2. But until then, have a good one.